Hi, Jesse Grimes here, coming at you from wet and chilly western Montana. This next video is all about me finally getting to work on building my house for the winter. But before we get to that, I'd like to say thank you to my newest patrons, which are all very close to home. The first is my brother-in-law, Jason Wesley. Next is Jocelyn Campbell, right here at Wheaton Labs. And next is Permaculture Quest, which is actually Evan and Charlotte, my neighbors here in the Ant Village. And they're going to be doing their own permaculture videos and Patreon, so make sure you go and check them out. It's going to be really cool. They're at patreon.com/permaculturequest. So now on to my video. Hope you enjoy. It's late October, winter is approaching fast, and I'm finally getting started on my house. Better late than never, I guess. After leveling out the pad, the first thing to do was dig lots of post holes, 3 feet deep through a hard clay layer. This meant lots of time with the rock bar, but it gets the bottom of the posts below the frost line, and will hold the posts in place while the rest of the structure is built. We collected gravel from my plot and put it in the bottom of the holes to hopefully keep water off the bottom of the posts. This was tamped, and then we were ready to raise the first post. Thankfully, the posts for this structure are small enough that we could lift them up by hand. The post is held vertical and straight, and then dirt is filled in around it, tamping every few inches with the rock bar. We also put a small amount of borax in the dirt around the posts. This will hopefully deter microbial activity and keep the posts from rotting as quick. And while sinking posts in the dirt is certainly not as good as a foundation as far as longevity goes, it does make construction a lot easier and quicker, as the posts will hold themselves up, and that's really my priority at this time. This structure is going to have a very small footprint, only 8 feet by 10 feet, 6 feet tall in the back and 11 feet tall in the front. It will have a simple shed roof and will be earth sheltered, with soil on top of the roof as well as anywhere there isn't doors or windows. As you can see here, we attached boards between the outer 2 posts to make sure that the center post was in line. I used the same method with the boards for the posts on the east and west walls. This method also has an added benefit in that once you get the post in position, you can screw it into the boards, and this will hold it in place while you backfill and tamp the post hole. Shelby was helping with the cleanup following the Rocket Mass Heaters event, so a lot of the time I was working by myself on the project, which required some creative use of tools and techniques. Nonetheless, I was able to get the rest of the major posts installed and ready to move on to the next phase of the project. The next step was to cut off the posts at the right level, and again the boards came in handy, acting as guides for the chainsaw. Since the ground is uneven and couldn't be used as a reference point, we used the water level to transfer the height of the rear post to the front posts, giving me a reference point to work off of. Then I screwed another board into the middle post at the appropriate height and leveled it off with the other posts. On top of this board rested some even longer boards, which are positioned to where the bottom of the beams will be. Then, after installing even more boards to give me a place to stand, I was able to use these long boards as a guide for the chainsaw to cut these posts at the proper angle. It was about this time that we started referring to the project as the Jungle Gym, as I was spending a lot of time climbing all around. The next step in the process was to flatten off the tops of my beams using my chainsaw mill. At first, I tried a method I'd read about in a chainsaw lumber making book, but this turned out to be way too complicated and time consuming for what I needed to do. So instead, I just made one very long board out of many smaller boards and used that as a guide for my flat edge. This is quite a good thing, as I not only had to flatten off the tops of my beams, but both sides of my purlins as well. I chose to do all this mill work so that joining my beams and purlins together would be much more simple. Flattening off the tops of my beams with my chainsaw mill also made cutting the notches for my posts much easier. First, I just had to measure the distance between the back posts and the other posts. Then I could transfer these measurements to my beams and use my chainsaw mill to cut out the notches parallel to the top of the beam. This made a nice flat surface at the correct angle for the post to rest on, without having to do any chisel work or fancy notching. And once I got one notch cut for the bottom posts, I was able to use this first beam as a guide to cut the other beams. The flat surface on top of the beams made sure that everything was lined up and at the same angle. A big part of why I chose to cut all the notches this way is because the excavator had not yet returned to Ant Village. I had to cut 9 notches in 3 beams without ever being able to hold the beams in place. I had to cut everything based off measurements and hope it fit once I got it up there. I managed to get all my beams cut and notched just in time for the excavator to return to my plot. All that was left was to do the final cuts on the posts and get ready for some heavy lifting. The day had finally arrived to raise my 3 beams into place and get me a lot closer to having a winter shelter. Josh, one of my neighbors in the Ant Village, was gracious enough to help me out by operating the excavator and gingerly lifting these very heavy logs into place. Once he got it over the structure, I was able to very carefully climb up and guide it into place. And hey, it actually fit! After successfully installing the center beam, we moved on to the west wall beam, which was the most complicated since it had 4 posts that had to fit into notches. Once again, I climbed up onto the jungle gym and helped line up the beam as Josh very carefully and very slowly lowered it into place. Once I made sure the beam was in fact well settled into place, I secured it by drilling a 3/8 inch hole at each of the joints and pounding in a section of 3/8 inch rebar. The ridges on this rebar are actually a little bit bigger than 3/8 inch, so that provides quite a bit of friction and helps hold everything in place. Just to be sure, I bent over about the last 4 inches of the rebar into a hook to make sure nothing lifted up or moved around. Finally, we raised the east wall beam into place. This one was actually a little bit tricky, since the weight of the beam on the long post kept pulling it out of vertical and making the notches not line up. We managed to fix the problem using a bit of ingenuity and some ratchet straps. Now that the beams were installed, it was time to install the purlins, which are cross members that go perpendicular to the beams and hold up the roof boards. Since I had flattened off the beams and both sides of the purlins, this was as easy as lifting them into position and screwing them down with some heavy-duty construction screws. It also gave me a chance to practice my jungle gym yoga. We managed to get 3 out of the 9 purlins installed before the first big winter storm of the season rolled into the Ant Village, dropping a large amount of rain and forcing me to throw a tarp over the whole project. Looks like I might be losing the race with winter this year.